I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into that room. After 40 years reading people, silence like that means danger. 7 cameras watched. 8 guests sat frozen. My daughter wouldn't meet my eyes. Then my son-in-law smiled, raised his glass, and knocked my plate to the floor. If you're still hungry, the floor is always an option. No one moved, no one spoke. I stood calm, leaned close, and whispered, "I know everything." His face collapsed. Because for 22 days I had already been watching him too. He thought he controlled everything in that house completely. Welcome to Revenge, Dad, where every story has a reckoning. Thank you for being here. It means everything. Now, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, city, country? Wherever you are, I want to know. One thing to keep in mind, this story blends narrative fiction with meaningful educational content. Names and settings are coincidental, but the message carried inside this story is one I hope stays with you. There are dinners, are wrong the moment you walk through the door. Not because of anything you can name, not the food, not the music, not the guest list. It's something in the air itself, something that presses against your chest the way a storm does before the first crack of lightning. I've spent 40 years reading rooms and reading people. I built a career out of noticing what nobody else thought to look for. So, when I walked into Beckett Crane's house that Saturday evening in March and felt the temperature of the room settle wrong against my skin, I didn't question it. I just started paying attention. The drive down from Concord had taken 40 minutes on Route 2, the bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet riding shotgun, like evidence I needed to protect. My daughter Ilara had called me 6 days earlier, the most recent of several calls across 3 weeks that had kept me from sleeping. A Tuesday afternoon call that lasted 4 minutes and left me staring at my kitchen wall long after she'd hung up. Her voice had been too careful, the kind of careful you use when someone is nearby and listening. Beacon Hill in March looks like a postcard that knows something is wrong. The gas lamps along Chestnut Street throw amber light on the cobblestones. The old brick row houses stand shoulder to shoulder, keeping their secrets, and the bare trees reach into the dark sky, like they're asking questions nobody wants to answer. Beckett and Ilara's house sat midway down the block. 4 stories of federal-style architecture that had cost more than I'd earned across my entire government career. It was beautiful the way a museum is beautiful, cold and curated and meant to impress. Beckett answered before the second ring. He stood in the doorway wearing a charcoal blazer over an open-collar shirt, the careful casualness of a man who'd spent 20 minutes deciding what to look like he hadn't thought about. He was 32, with the kind of even features that photograph as trustworthy and read as something else entirely in person. His smile arrived on schedule. "Theodore, right on time. Come in." The entry hall stopped me for just a breath. The photographs were gone. Ilara and I had hung a dozen of them 18 months ago, her mother and me at her college graduation. The 3 of us at Cape Cod before my wife got sick. Ilara at 22, standing in front of her first architectural project, with paint on her cheek and pure joy on her face. All of it replaced by a large canvas of black angular shapes against gray. The kind of art that costs a great deal of money to mean absolutely nothing. The dining room held 8 people around a table that gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Jazz came softly from speakers embedded in the walls, low, sophisticated, chosen. I recognized 2 of Beckett's colleagues from Boston Medical Center, and a woman named Simone Alcott, who Ilara had introduced to me 2 years ago as her closest friend from graduate school. Simone sat close enough to Beckett that their shoulders nearly touched. She wore a red dress chosen with obvious precision and carried a laugh that arrived before anyone finished saying anything funny. Then Ilara came out of the kitchen and my chest tightened. She moved through the room, the way water moves through a cracked glass, finding the path of least resistance, occupying only the space she absolutely had to. Thinner than Christmas. Her eyes found mine and lit up for exactly 1 second before something switched off behind them. She hugged me the way you hug an acquaintance at a funeral. "Dad, I'm so glad you made it." She squeezed my arm and moved away before I could hold on. Dinner unfolded the way Beckett orchestrated everything, with the appearance of ease and the reality of total control. He guided conversation from the head of the table, dispensing attention in careful portions. When he turned to me, the shift was subtle enough that only someone trained to notice would catch it. "Hey, Theodore, you must keep yourself busy up in Concord," he said during the pause between courses. His tone carried polite curiosity like a knife carries a handle. The 40 years with the Bureau, that's a different era entirely. The field has evolved so much since then. New methodologies, new technology. It must be strange watching from the outside. Around the table, his colleagues nodded. I smiled and said something about enjoying the quiet. Beckett accepted this graciously as if he'd done me a favor. Throughout the meal, I watched my daughter. She ate almost nothing. Each time she reached for her water glass, her hand trembled at the wrist, a fine, barely visible tremor, the kind certain medications produce at certain doses. Before she spoke to anyone, her eyes moved to Beckett first, a reflex so practiced it had become invisible to her. Simone touched Beckett's forearm twice during dinner. Not his hand, his forearm, the gesture of someone long accustomed to the territory. Beckett stood to make a toast, his promotion, his gratitude, the bright future of behavioral medicine at Boston Medical Center. He was eloquent and precisely self-deprecating. The room leaned toward him, the way rooms do for people who learned young that attention is something you take. He was gesturing broadly when the back of his hand connected with the edge of my plate. Too smooth. The contact was too smooth, too well angled for a man who spent his career studying human behavior. The plate slid off the table and hit the hardwood floor, scattering the meal across pale wood in a mess that landed like punctuation. The table went quiet. Beckett looked down at the floor. His expression arranged itself into something that resembled remorse, the way a photograph resembles a living face. Then he raised his wine glass, and his voice came out warm and lightly amused. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Theodore. I guess if you're still hungry, the floor is always an option." Someone inhaled sharply at the far end of the table. One of Beckett's colleagues found something fascinating in his napkin. Simone pressed her fingers to her mouth and let a sound escape through them that she didn't bother to suppress. My daughter's face went the color of old paper. She looked at the floor. She looked at her hands. She did not look at me. I sat with that for 3 seconds. Then I stood up. I adjusted my jacket slowly the way you move when panic is a luxury you stopped allowing yourself decades ago. I walked around the table. Beckett's smirk began losing its architecture as I leaned down close enough to smell his cologne, something expensive and deliberately chosen. I kept my voice below the music. "I know everything." The color left his face like a light switching off. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time all evening, Beckett Crane had no performance ready. I straightened up, nodded once to the table, and walked out. The night air on Chestnut Street was sharp and clean. I got in my car and sat with both hands resting on the steering wheel in the amber dark. I didn't start the engine, because before you can understand what those 3 words meant, you need to know what I'd spent the last 3 weeks learning. The story doesn't begin at that dinner table. It begins 22 days earlier with a phone call I almost didn't answer. 3 weeks before that dinner on Beacon Hill, I was sitting at my kitchen table in Concord at 2:15 in the morning, holding a phone that had gone silent 40 seconds ago. Alara had called me. She'd whispered 4 words, "Dad, something is wrong." And then the line had gone quiet in that particular way that isn't a dropped call. It's the silence of someone who just heard footsteps in the hallway. The call ended. I sat in the dark with a cold cup of coffee and 2 years of retirement pressing down on my chest, like a stone I'd been pretending wasn't there. I want to tell you, I was surprised. I wasn't. The truth is, I'd been collecting pieces for 6 months, the way you collect evidence without letting yourself name what you're building. A profiler's habit, you don't form conclusions until the picture is complete, because conclusions make you stop looking. And I couldn't afford to stop looking, not when my daughter was the subject. Let me take you back to February of that year, when I finally let myself see what I'd been carefully not seeing. Alara had always been the kind of woman who filled a room without trying. As a girl, she'd argued with me about everything: baseball statistics, the ethics of capital punishment, whether a particular bridge design was structurally elegant or just expensive. She'd earned her architecture degree at MIT with the kind of focused ferocity that made her professors remember her name. When she laughed, people turned around to find out what they were missing. The woman I'd been watching for 6 months laughed at the right moments and in the right amounts. That was the difference. She'd learned to calibrate it. The last time I'd seen her in person before that February morning was Christmas, a visit that lasted 3 hours before Beckett found a reason to shorten it. She'd worn a long-sleeve sweater, despite the fact that they kept their house at 72 degrees. When I'd mentioned it, she'd said she was just cold lately. New mothers often run cold. Beckett had explained from across the room without looking up from his phone. He had a medical explanation for everything about my daughter. That should have been the first thing I named. I thought about the phone calls. In the 18 months since Nora was born, I'd spoken to Alara alone, truly alone, without Beckett answering first, or appearing in the background maybe 4 times. Every other attempt went to voicemail. and Beckett would return the call within the hour. Always pleasant, always reasonable, always with a perfectly logical account of why Alara couldn't come to the phone just then. She was nursing, she was sleeping. The baby had been up all night and they were both exhausted. Reasonable, always so reasonable. I thought about what I knew professionally about men like Beckett Crane. In behavioral psychology, gaslighting refers to a specific and sustained pattern of psychological manipulation in which one person causes another to question their own memory, perception, and sanity. It's named after a 1944 film, but the behavior is as old as human cruelty. I'd seen it in interrogation rooms across 4 decades, the way a certain kind of person rewrites reality around them so completely that the people closest to them lose their footing. They stop trusting their own observations. They start apologizing for things they didn't do. They become dependent on the person rewriting their world because that person is the only source of certainty left. Sitting at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, I let myself say it for the first time. My son-in-law was doing this to my daughter, deliberately, systematically, and he had been doing it for long enough that she'd called me in the middle of the night and hung up when she heard him coming. I called her back at 7 the next morning. Beckett answered on the second ring. "Theodore?" His voice was warm the way good furniture is warm, solid, expensive, and manufactured. "She's resting. The baby kept her up most of the night. You know how it goes." "Of course," I said. "Tell her I called." "Will do." A pause perfectly timed. "It's good that you check in. She worries about you up there alone in Concord. We both do." He hung up before I could respond. He always hung up first. I sat with that for a long time. Then I got up, went to the bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, and took out a photograph I kept face down under a stack of winter sweaters. Alara on her wedding day 3 years ago. She was laughing at something just outside the frame, a real laugh, the full body kind, the kind that couldn't be calibrated. Her eyes were the eyes I'd watched learn to read, learn to drive, learn to see the load-bearing structures of buildings, the way I'd learned to see the load-bearing structures of people. Those eyes had been somewhere else every time I'd seen her since. I don't know how long I stood there holding that photograph. Long enough for the winter light, coming through the bedroom window, to shift from gray to pale gold. Long enough to understand that the careful collecting part of this was over. I went to my desk. In the back of the bottom drawer, beneath a folder of old case files I'd never quite managed to throw away, was a notebook, black cover, narrow-ruled, the same kind I'd used for 30 years at the bureau. I hadn't opened one in 2 years. Retirement, I'd told myself, meant leaving the notebooks behind. I sat down, uncapped a pen, and wrote 2 words at the top of the first page: Beckett Crane. Then I started writing everything I remembered. By the time I finished, the coffee had gone cold again, and the morning had fully arrived outside my window. I closed the notebook and looked west toward Boston, where the skyline was just visible as a gray suggestion behind the February haze. I'd driven that road 100 times. I knew every interchange, every exit, every mile of it. I knew that when I drove it next, everything would be different. The only question that remained, the one I couldn't answer sitting alone in Concord with a cold cup of coffee and a notebook full of evidence, was what exactly I would find when I got there and looked Beckett Crane in the eye up close. I'd spent 40 years looking people in the eye. I already had a feeling I wasn't going to like what I saw. Still weeks before that fateful dinner, I came to Beacon Hill the first time with the simplest reason a grandfather could have: I missed my granddaughter. But I had already slipped my old FBI case notebook into my inside jacket pocket before I stepped out of the car. The house sat at the end of a narrow red brick street, 4 stories of federal-style architecture, pressed between 2 equally immaculate neighbors. A polished brass knocker, window boxes with trimmed boxwood, not a single leaf out of place on the front steps. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, a canvas bag of toys in one hand and a container of chicken soup in the other, and I let myself look at the building, the way I used to look at crime scenes, not at what was there, but at what was missing. There were no signs that a newborn lived here, no stroller folded by the door, no burp cloth draped over a railing, no exhausted half-awake quality to the house that every new parent's home quietly broadcasts. Alara had given birth to Nora 6 weeks ago. I had expected chaos. I found a showroom. Beckett opened the door before I reached the top step. "Theodore." He said my name the way a man says the name of someone he has already assessed and found unthreatening. His handshake was firm, practiced. "Come in. Ilara's just finishing feeding Nora." The interior matched the exterior. Everything arranged, everything curated. Dark hardwood floors without a single toy scattered across them. a cream-colored sofa without a single spit-up stain. Abstract paintings on the walls, mostly gray and charcoal, the kind that suggests sophistication without inviting warmth. I set the soup in the kitchen and let him give me the tour he had clearly prepared. I counted the first camera in the hallway, a small dome unit angled toward the front door, security brand high resolution. I said nothing. I noted the position. Alara appeared at the top of the stairs, holding Nora, and something in my chest tightened immediately. My daughter had always been the kind of person who walked into a room and quietly rearranged it around her, confident, certain, with an architect's eye for what belonged where. The woman descending those stairs moved carefully, as if she was uncertain the floor would hold her weight. She smiled when she saw me. It was the right shape of a smile, but it stopped at her cheekbones. "Dad." She let me hug her one-armed Nora pressed between us. I held Nora and looked at my granddaughter's face, 8 weeks old. Dark lashes, a serious expression that newborns sometimes carry as though they already understand something adults have forgotten. Nora barely cried. I had expected the noise of a new baby. Instead, the house was almost silent. I counted the second camera above the kitchen archway, the third near the living room window angled toward the sofa. I moved through the house slowly, the way a grandfather would, pausing to admire Beckett's framed degrees and the architect's blueprints Alara had mounted on the study wall, her work. Though Beckett referred to them as one of Ilara's little projects from before, Ilara did not correct him. The fourth camera was in the corner of the study, the fifth at the top of the staircase landing. Beckett spoke at length over tea. His new role as Director of Clinical Psychology at Boston Medical Center, the grant proposal he was writing, his former supervisor, who had finally recognized real talent when he saw it. He used the word "we" when describing his accomplishments and the word "I" when describing Ilara's limitations. It was subtle enough that you could miss it if you weren't listening the right way. I had spent 40 years listening the right way. At one point, Beckett mentioned that Ilara had been struggling with memory lately. He said it gently with the exact tone of a concerned husband. Ilara looked at the table. She did not agree or disagree. She simply became smaller. I found the sixth camera in the hallway outside the bathroom. The seventh was in the mudroom near the back door to the garden. It was Ilara who suggested we step outside to see the garden. Beckett excused himself briefly to take a work call, he said. It was the only 30 seconds in 3 hours that he left the two of us without line of sight. Ilara took my hand the moment the back door closed behind us. Her grip was tighter than I expected. "Dad!" Her voice dropped to something just above a whisper. "I keep forgetting things. Beckett says it's postpartum depression. He says it's normal. But Dad..." The back door opened. Beckett appeared with his phone already lowered, the call apparently concluded. He smiled at us both, crossed to Ilara's side, and placed a hand on the small of her back. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. The sentence she had been building quietly disappeared. We stayed another 40 minutes. When I left, Beckett shook my hand again at the door. "Always good to see you, Theodore. Ilara worries about you being alone up in Concord. We should do this more often." "We should," I said. We both knew that neither of us meant it as a pleasantry. I walked to my car, set the empty soup container on the passenger seat, and opened my notebook. I wrote down each camera position angle model where I could identify it. 7 total. Full coverage of every primary room and entry point in the house. Then I wrote one question beneath the list. Whose behavior is this system designed to monitor? I drove back toward my hotel on the edge of the city. No music, no radio. 7 cameras in a private home where a new mother was slowly forgetting who she was, and a husband who never let her finish a sentence when her father was standing 3 feet away. I had a feeling that the next time I walked through that front door, I would not be arriving as a grandfather. February 2025, first week, late evening room 214, a small hotel, Cambridge, Massachusetts. 15 minutes by car from Beacon Hill. In 40 years with the FBI, I learned one thing they never put in any training manual. The most dangerous person in the room is never the loudest one. It is always the one who has already counted every camera you haven't noticed yet. That night, sitting alone in my hotel room in Cambridge, I understood something with complete clarity. Beckett Crane had been counting me. I spread my notebook open on the small desk beside the window. The city outside was quiet at this hour, the kind of Boston quiet that isn't really silence, just noise compressed under cold air. I uncapped my pen and began to draw from memory. 40 years of crime scene reconstruction means you develop a specific kind of recall, not photographic something more deliberate than that. You train yourself to encode space the way a chess player encodes a board. Exits, angles, blind spots. I drew the floor plan of Beckett's Beacon Hill house from the front door to the back garden, room by room marking each camera position with a small circle and a directional arrow. When I finished, I sat back and looked at what I had drawn. 7 cameras in a private home. The first thing a security professional installs cameras to protect is property valuables entry points, the perimeter. What Beckett had installed protected none of those things with any efficiency. The camera in the hallway faced inward toward the living room, not outward toward the front door. The one in the study was angled low toward the chair where a visitor would sit, not toward the bookshelves or the window. The camera outside the upstairs bathroom covered the length of the corridor between the master bedroom and the guest bathroom. Not a single unit was positioned to catch an intruder coming through a window or door. Every camera in that house was pointed at the people inside it. I picked up my phone and called Marcus Webb. Marcus had been the FBI Boston Field Office's senior technical analyst for 11 years before he moved into private consulting. We had worked a surveillance case together in 2019. A financial fraud operation that required 3 months of covert monitoring in a Brookline office building. Marcus understood surveillance systems the way a cardiologist understands an EKG, not just what it shows, but what the pattern means. He answered on the second ring. "Theodore." A pause, the sound of a chair adjusting. "It's past 10. This is either nothing or it's something." "It's something," I said. I described the layout. Camera positions, angles, model types, where I had been able to identify them. I read from my notebook without editorializing. Marcus was quiet throughout. When I finished, he was silent for 4 seconds. I counted. "That's not a home security system," he said. "What you're describing is a behavioral monitoring array. High-resolution units positioned at conversation height, angled to capture facial expressions and body language, not movement or perimeter breach. Whoever installed that system wasn't trying to keep people out. They were trying to record what people do when they think they're not being watched. I already knew that. I needed to hear someone else say it. I need 3 things, I told him. A selective signal disruptor narrowband, something I can carry on my person that kills a specific camera's feed without triggering a system alert. A microphone unit small enough to fit inside a coat button, and a signal duplicator that can loop a camera's last clean frame so the live feed shows nothing has changed. Another pause. "That's a serious package, Theodore. I know what it is." "You going to tell me why—" "My daughter," I said. That was all I said. Marcus was quiet again. Then, "Give me 48 hours. After I hung up, I called Garrett Okafor. Garrett had spent 22 years as a field agent at the FBI's Boston office before transitioning to a senior advisory role with the Massachusetts State Police. He was the kind of man who had seen enough in his career that almost nothing surprised him, and who understood, without needing it, explained. The difference between official channels and the kind of work that had to be done before official channels could be used. I gave him the short version. Beckett Crane, the cameras, Ilara's unfinished sentence in the garden, the medications in the bathroom cabinet to high-dose sedatives prescribed to a woman 6 weeks postpartum. Garrett listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I'm not hearing anything actionable yet, Theodore." "I know. I'm not asking you to act. I'm asking you to be ready." "How long?" "I don't know yet. Weeks, maybe." "All right," he said. "Keep me in the loop." I set the phone down on the desk beside my notebook. The diagram of Beckett's house looked back at me, 7 small circles, 7 arrows. 7 blind spots that Beckett believed were his alone to see through. He was wrong about that now. I stood and walked to the mirror above the bathroom sink. The man looking back at me was 60 years old, silver hair. A slight forward lean in the shoulders from too many years hunched over case files. Lines around the eyes that hadn't been there when Eleanor was alive. Nothing about my face announced threat. Nothing about my posture suggested calculation. That was going to be useful. I began to practice. I let my shoulders drop another ½ inch. I softened the set of my jaw, the unconscious tension I carry there, a habit from decades of interview rooms. I let my gaze go slightly unfocused, the way a man looks when his thoughts are gentle and distant rather than precise. I walked toward the mirror and back slower than my natural pace. The walk of a man whose knees ache more than he admits. The walk of a father who loves his daughter and worries quietly and does not fully understand the world his son-in-law moves through. I had worn many faces in 40 years of field work. This one, the harmless, slightly confused, emotionally accessible retired father, was going to be the most important performance of my career. The only audience would be a 32-year-old narcissistic psychologist who had spent his entire professional life reading people manipulating their self-perception and dismantling their confidence from the inside out. I could not afford a single false note. I turned off the bathroom light and stood at the window, looking southeast toward the dark shape of Beacon Hill against the city glow. Alara was somewhere in that house right now. Nora was somewhere in that house. And Beckett Crane was in that house, watching whatever his 7 cameras had recorded today, reviewing the footage of a 60-year-old man carrying soup and children's toys. Tomorrow I would walk back through that front door. This time I would bring something Beckett Crane had never encountered in his entire career in forensic psychology. Not evidence, not accusation. Patience. Marcus Webb once told me that the best technology is the technology your adversary doesn't know you're using. That morning, when I stepped through the front door of Beckett Crane's house carrying a box of my late wife's belongings and the smile of a grandfather trying to share old memories with his daughter, I was carrying the best technology Marcus could prepare. The box itself was ordinary, a medium-sized cardboard container, the kind you buy flat at a hardware store and fold yourself. Inside, Eleanor's old recipe journal, a set of hand-painted ceramic coasters she had collected from a trip to Vermont, 3 framed photographs from Alara's childhood, and a small velvet pouch of costume jewelry that Alara had always admired. Every item was genuine. Every item had been selected because it gave me a reason to move through multiple rooms of the house without raising suspicion. The 3 devices Marcus had prepared were hidden inside the lining of my jacket. Alara opened the door before I had a chance to knock. She must have seen me coming up the front steps through the window. The first thing I noticed was that she looked different, not better. Not healthier, but lighter in a specific way that I recognized immediately. The way a room feels different when a pressure system has moved on. Beckett was at the clinic. Dad. She stepped back to let me in, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there during my last visit. Not relief exactly. More like the absence of a particular kind of tension. As though a frequency she had been bracing against had temporarily gone quiet. I set the box on the kitchen table and let her go through it slowly. She held each item with the careful attention of someone handling things that are more fragile than they look. When she reached Eleanor's recipe journal, she pressed it to her chest briefly and closed her eyes. I gave her that moment without commentary. In my left ear, barely audible over the ambient sound of the kitchen, Marcus's voice came through the micro receiver he had fitted to look like a standard hearing aid insert. You've got the layout. Kitchen first, the outlet behind the bookshelf in the adjoining sitting room, then the bathroom, then the study. Don't rush, you've got time. Let me hold Nora while you make some coffee, I said. Alara handed me the baby, with a gratitude that was disproportionate to the offer. That told me something. A mother who had support didn't look grateful, that way quietly, almost surprised. She looked that way when support was rare enough to register. I settled into the armchair in the sitting room, with Nora against my chest, and let my eyes move across the room the way they always did, cataloging, measuring, noting. The bookshelf against the east wall. The outlet at its base, half hidden behind a stack of Beckett's psychology journals. I shifted Nora to my left arm. My right hand moved to my jacket pocket. Count of 3, Marcus said. Drop the keys, natural motion. Don't look at the outlet when you stand back up. I let my keys slip from my fingers. They hit the hardwood with a sound that Alara registered from the kitchen she glanced over. I waved my free hand in the mild, self-deprecating way of a man who drops things sometimes. She turned back to the coffee maker. I knelt, retrieved the keys with my left hand, and pressed the first device against the back panel of the outlet with my right. The magnetic coupling took in under 2 seconds. I was back in the armchair before Nora finished the small sound she had been making. Device 1 is live, Marcus confirmed. Signal is clean. Alara brought coffee and sat across from me. She began to talk, not about anything in particular at first. The neighborhood. A neighbor who had brought a casserole when Nora was born. Small things. The verbal equivalent of testing ice before you put weight on it. Then gradually she began to talk about the forgetting. It's been happening more, she said. I left the stove on last Tuesday. Beckett found it when he came home. He showed me the burn marks on the pot. She paused, turning her mug in both hands. I don't remember cooking anything that morning. Do you think you might have and simply forgotten? I asked. She looked at the table. That's what Beckett says. He says I've been doing things and then not remembering them. He has examples. He remembers them very clearly. She stopped again. It's strange. Dad. He remembers conversations I don't remember having. In detail. Specific words. I kept my expression soft and my voice gentle. Inside what I was hearing had a name I had encountered in behavioral casework many times across my career. Gaslighting, the systematic manipulation of a person's perception of reality, done gradually and with precision until the target begins to doubt their own memory, their own judgment, their own sanity. It is not an accident. It requires planning. It requires consistency. And it requires that the person doing it be close enough to the target to control their environment completely. Beckett Crane had 7 cameras and a prescription pad. I asked Allura if I could use the bathroom. She pointed me upstairs. I moved through the hallway at the pace of a man who was not in a hurry, stepped into the bathroom, and located the mirror housing. The second device fit behind the mirror bracket in a single motion. Device 2 is live. Marcus confirmed. The study was the last room. Allura hesitated when I mentioned it, a brief pause barely visible. Beckett doesn't really like people in there, she said. Then she seemed to catch herself as if hearing how that sounded. But I'm sure it's fine. He's just particular about his files. She led me in and stood near the door while I made a slow, appreciative show of examining the framed degrees on the wall. The desk was in the center of the room. Positioned to face the door, deliberate I noted, a power arrangement. The computer screen was in sleep mode, casting a faint gray glow. In the fraction of a second before the screen darkened completely, I saw the spreadsheet. Column headers, dates, dollar figures, and a title at the top of the document in a standard system font, unremarkable except for what it said. Allura Policy Transfer Timeline. I did not stop walking. I did not change my expression. I moved to the desk lamp on the far corner of the desk, made a small comment about the quality of the light for reading, and crouched to examine the base with the attention of a man who appreciates good design. The third device locked into place behind the lamp's base housing. Marcus had built it to sit flush against the metal, invisible at normal inspection distance, indistinguishable from the lamp's own wiring hardware. Device 3 is live, Marcus said. Full array is active. Theodore, we're in. I stood and turned back to Allura. Beckett has a very organized workspace, I said. He clearly knows exactly what he wants. Allura nodded. She did not hear anything in that sentence. I had not intended her to. At the front door, I held her longer than usual. Then I held Nora, pressed my lips to the top of the baby's head, and breathed in for a moment before I handed her back. I walked to my car. I did not look back at the house. 3 blocks away, I pulled to the curb and called Marcus. Devices are in position, I said. Start the monitoring. There was a pause shorter than I expected, as if he had already been watching. Theodore, he said, I'm already seeing things you need to know about. There is a truth I learned in the earliest years of my career, before I had a title or a federal badge or any of the institutional weight that eventually accumulates over 4 decades of service. Evidence never lies. People lie. Narratives lie. Memories can be shaped distorted and rebuilt from the ground up by someone who knows precisely how human recall works and how to exploit its weaknesses. But a recording made at the right moment from the right angle, with no human hand between the lens and the light, that tells only one thing: the truth. That evening I sat in the straight-back chair beside the window of my hotel room and watched the truth about my daughter's life unspool across a 12-inch screen. My coffee had gone cold. I did not notice. Marcus had connected through an encrypted channel 40 minutes after I returned from Beacon Hill, a precaution so automatic for both of us that neither of us mentioned it. His face occupied a small window in the upper corner of my screen, his expression carrying the particular, careful neutrality of a man who has already seen the footage and is watching to see how someone else receives it. The rest of the screen was the feed from the sitting room device. That's starting from when Crane came home, Marcus said. 4:17 p.m. Beckett entered the front door at 4:17, exactly the timestamp precise in the lower right corner. He set his briefcase on the hall table, in the exact same position it had occupied when I visited that morning, a designated place, a deliberate habit. Allura appeared from the kitchen, still wearing the same gray cardigan from earlier in the day. She said something. Marcus switched to audio. Did you take your medication? No greeting, no acknowledgement of her presence as a person returning to after a day apart. His first words were a clinical assessment delivered in the flat, evaluative register of a physician confirming patient compliance. I had spent 40 years interviewing people in rooms where everything said and unsaid carried weight. I knew the difference between care expressed as care and care deployed as surveillance. Allura said she had taken it. Beckett nodded without looking at her and walked toward the study. The second clip. Dinner approximately 6:30. Alara mentioned my visit, her voice carrying a brightness that was slightly too deliberate, the careful presentation of someone who has learned to frame information in advance of criticism. She said I had brought some of her mother's belongings, that Nora had been calm, that it had been a good visit. Beckett set his fork down with a precise, unhurried motion. Your father means well, he said, but he doesn't understand your condition, Alara. You know that. Alara nodded. It was not the nod of agreement. It was not the nod of a woman who had heard her husband's words and found them reasonable. It was the nod of someone who had learned, through repetition and consequence, that agreement was the path of least resistance, and that any other response would cost her something she could not afford to spend. I had seen that particular posture before, in interview rooms, in shelters on the faces of people who had been managed down to a single available response over a long period of time. I looked away from the screen. I looked at the wall. I took a breath and returned to the footage. Third clip, Marcus said, and there was something almost gentle in how he said it. A warning dressed as a transition. Beckett at his desk, the study door closed. He opened his laptop with the confidence of a man returning to work he has already planned and navigated to a spreadsheet without hesitation. The document filled most of his screen, and 4 full seconds passed before he scrolled. The title bar held steady long enough for the device angle to capture it cleanly. Alara Policy Transfer Timeline. Marcus sent the still image to a separate window. I examined it without speaking. Column headers across the top, date, action required, status, dependencies. Below those, a structured sequence of entries running from January through late March. The word signature appeared 3 times in the status column. 2 were marked pending. 1 dated 2 weeks prior. Was marked delayed subject resistant. The policy value was listed in the header cell, $8,750,000. 3-phase structure. Marcus said, his voice carrying the measured analytical tone he used when the subject matter was serious, and he had already processed his own reaction to it privately. Phase 1 is isolation, systematically reducing access to external support networks, family, friends, professional peers. Phase 2 is destabilization, constructing conditions of self-doubt, confusion, and emotional dependency. Phase 3 is legal execution, obtaining the required documents once the target is sufficiently isolated and her judgment sufficiently compromised. I had read profiles like this in federal casework, detailed, deliberate, methodical, the kind of planning that does not emerge from anger or impulse, the kind that requires a clinical understanding of human psychology and the patience to apply it over months. I had never expected to read one with my daughter's name in the header. The afternoon footage, Marcus said. 3 p.m. You need to see this one without me explaining it first. The sitting room device timestamp, reading 3:04. The baby monitor on the kitchen counter, visible at the edge of the frame, its green light steady. Alara was upstairs sleeping. At the dosage levels Beckett had administered that morning, she would not have registered sound below a certain threshold, another effect he had calculated in advance. The front door opened. No knock, no hesitation at the threshold. Simone Alcott walked in with her own key. She moved through the hallway with the ease of someone who has never experienced this space as unfamiliar, straight into the study. She settled into the chair positioned alongside Beckett's desk, not the visitor's chair across from it, but the one beside it, the chair that implied collaboration rather than appointment. She opened her own laptop and began working. She stayed for 40 minutes. She left at 3:44, locking the front door behind her with the same key. The baby monitor showed green throughout. Alara never came downstairs. I had seen Simone Alcott at the dinner party 3 weeks from now, in my timeline, a red dress, a practiced smile. Her hand resting on Beckett's forearm in a way that registered as too familiar for the context. I had filed her then as a variable I did not yet understand. I understood her now. She was not Alara's friend who happened to know Beckett. She was Beckett's partner in this, positioned inside Alara's life to function as a trusted presence while reporting everything inward. Marcus asked, "You doing all right, Theodore?" I closed the footage window. I sat in the dark of the hotel room for a moment, the city sound coming faint through the glass. Then I said, and my voice came out level, in the way that only happens when you have spent a career training yourself to keep it that way under pressure. Pull everything on Simone Alcott. I want to know who she is, how long she has been accessing that house, and exactly what Beckett has promised her. Marcus was already typing. Already started, but Theodore, the typing stopped. There is one more clip from tonight. You need to see it. The loading indicator moved slowly across the bottom of the screen. I did not know what I was about to watch, but I had spent 40 years learning to read the faces of people who had already seen something they hadn't expected. And Marcus Webb at this moment was wearing that face. In 40 years, I have reviewed thousands of hours of evidence footage, interrogation recordings, surveillance feeds, wire captures, body cam transfers from federal operations, where the stakes were lives and sentences measured in decades. I learned early how to separate emotion from analysis, how to watch something terrible on a screen and keep the observing part of your mind clean and functional, how to be present in front of evidence without being consumed by it. Nobody teaches you how to watch footage of your own daughter. Marcus played the clip without preamble. The timestamp read 8:47 p.m., nearly 2 hours after I had left the house. Nora was already down for the night. The sitting room device showed Beckett and Alara across from each other on the cream sofa, the lamp casting the kind of warm domestic light that belongs on a family photograph. From a distance, it would have looked like a quiet evening between a husband and wife. Beckett was looking at Alara the way a clinician looks at a patient presenting with a symptom that confirms a diagnosis. His voice when Marcus brought up the audio was soft, measured, the voice of a man who understood exactly how much control resided in staying calm. "Do you remember what you said to your father today in the garden?" Alara looked at him. A small vertical line appeared between her brows, the expression of someone searching their own memory and finding it uncertain. "We talked about Mom's things," she said. "And Nora." Beckett tilted his head slightly. "You told him you thought I was poisoning you, Alara. Do you understand how concerning that is?" The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. I didn't say that. Her voice was quiet, unsure already not of Beckett, but of herself. That was the difference. She was not defending herself against an accusation. She was questioning her own recollection. "Sweetheart," Beckett leaned forward. "This is exactly what we discussed with Dr. Olson. The paranoid ideation is getting worse. I'm not angry. I'm worried." I sat completely still in my hotel room chair. I had been standing 3 feet from Alara the entire afternoon. I had heard every word she said in that garden before Beckett appeared at the back door and ended the conversation. She had said 4 words before being interrupted. "Dad, something is wrong." That was all she had managed. She had not said anything about poisoning. She had not said anything close to it. Beckett Crane had just constructed a memory that did not exist and delivered it to my daughter with the clinical authority of a man she had been conditioned to trust over years of marriage, and she was already beginning to doubt herself. Marcus paused the footage. "He's rewriting her memory in real time," he said. "This is textbook systematic gaslighting, not impulsive, deliberate, structured, repeated. He knows the terminology because he uses it professionally. He knows exactly where the seams in human memory are." I did not respond immediately. My phone showed a missed call from an unknown Massachusetts General Hospital, extension, time-stamped 5:22 p.m. I called it back. Dr. Margaret Olson had been Alara's attending physician at Massachusetts General for 11 months, assigned following a referral for postpartum depression evaluation shortly after Nora's birth. She answered on the 3rd ring, and there was a careful, precise quality to her voice that I recognized as someone who had been thinking through what they were about to say for several hours before saying it. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I want to be very clear about what I can and cannot tell you. I cannot share specifics of your daughter's medical file without her consent. What I can tell you is that I have significant professional concerns about the prescription management she is currently under, which falls outside my direct supervision. The medications she is receiving are not standard postpartum protocol. The dosages are higher than I would sanction for her presentation, and there have been alterations to her intake records that I did not authorize and cannot account for." And I asked her directly, "In your professional judgment, is my daughter being harmed?" A pause. "I have practiced medicine for 20 years, Mr. Whitfield. I have never filed a concern report without being certain. I am not yet certain. But I will tell you this. Something in this picture is very wrong, and I have been trying to reach someone in her family for 3 days. Yast, I need you to document everything you've just told me," I said. "In writing dated tonight. I will have an attorney contact you in the morning." After I ended the call, Marcus showed me the final segment of footage Beckett at the dining table. After Alara had gone upstairs, his laptop opened a document visible on screen. He turned it toward the chair where Alara had been sitting, as though rehearsing a presentation. The camera angle was not clean enough to read the full document. It did not need to be. The words beneficiary designation were visible in the header. Alara's hand had held a pen at dinner. She had not signed anything tonight. Tomorrow that might change. I stood and walked to the window. Boston at midnight carried its particular cold clarity, the kind of air that does not forgive imprecision. I called Constance Hale. Constance had been a trust and family law attorney in Boston for 18 years. I had worked with her once on an estate dispute tangential to a federal case, and I knew two things about her. She was meticulous, and she did not require a situation to be fully resolved before she began moving. Two things, I said when she answered. First, I need an irrevocable trust established immediately sole beneficiary my granddaughter Nora Crane, structured so that no single party can dissolve it without judicial review. Second, I need you to file for an emergency temporary guardianship order for my daughter first thing tomorrow morning. I will send you Dr. Olson's written assessment and supporting documentation tonight. Constance was quiet for a moment. Emergency temporary guardianship in Massachusetts requires demonstrable imminent risk of harm. If the medical documentation supports it, a judge can issue a temporary order within 48 to 72 hours. I will begin drafting immediately. After the call, I sat back down at the desk. I opened my notebook and wrote a list. Items I needed to accomplish in the next 48 hours in order of legal and practical priority. Near the bottom of the list was one item I had not mentioned to Constance or to Marcus or to Garrett. Something I needed to do myself before any court order was in place, before any official process was set in motion. Something that required only one other person, someone Beckett Crane had never anticipated. Tomorrow I was going to see Howard Briggs. People overlook the elderly. It is the most consistent mistake I observed across 4 decades of investigative work made by criminals by attorneys, by the most operationally intelligent people I ever encountered in federal service. They look through older people the way they look through glass, registering the surface without considering what lies behind it. They do not account for the fact that someone who has lived in the same house on the same street for 31 years now has accumulated a quantity of observed detail that no surveillance system can replicate. That was why Howard Briggs could see things that Beckett Crane had never thought to hide from. Garrett Okafor was already inside when I arrived. He had contacted Howard 2 days earlier, explaining only that a neighbor had raised concerns about the Crane household and that a family member wanted to speak with him informally. Howard had agreed without hesitation, which told me something about how long he had been waiting for someone to ask. Howard Briggs was 74 years old, a retired civil engineer who had lived in the same federal-style row house across from the Cranes since before Beckett had purchased the property. He was the kind of man who moved slowly and thought carefully and did not say things he wasn't sure of, qualities I had spent my career learning to recognize as more valuable than speed or certainty. He poured coffee from a percolator that looked older than my FBI badge and set 3 mugs on the kitchen table without asking if we wanted any. I was wondering when someone was going to come, he said, sitting down. He had noticed the Crane household in October of the previous year, when the young woman inside had been visibly pregnant and had still at that point been in the habit of opening the front curtains in the morning and waving to him across the street. A small thing, the kind of neighborly acknowledgement that costs nothing and means something. He had noticed when it stopped. November, he said. She stopped coming to the window in November, and about the same time the other woman started showing up. He described Simone Alcott without prompting, blonde mid-30s, drove a dark blue sedan, arrived most frequently on weekday afternoons between 2 and 4. He had noted her because she used a key. Not the hesitant borrowed key movement of someone house-sitting or checking on a friend, the automatic. Proprietary motion of someone who had been using that key long enough that it no longer required thought. She had that key before Christmas, Howard said. I remember because I saw her let herself in the day of the first big snowstorm. December, maybe the 12th or 13th. The young wife was home. I could see the lights upstairs. The blonde woman stayed about an hour and left before the husband got back. Garrett opened a small notebook and wrote the date without comment. Howard pushed a portable hard drive across the table toward me. It was a standard external unit, the kind sold at any electronics store, labeled with a piece of masking tape marked Front Street October to February. His camera system, he explained, covered the full width of his front exterior, a wide-angle unit installed after a car break-in, 3 years prior, angled to capture the sidewalk, the street, and the facing properties. Everything it had recorded was stored automatically to this drive on a 30-day rolling basis. He had manually backed up the footage from October onward when Garrett called. "I don't know what's happening in that house," Howard said. "But that young woman she used to wave every morning, she hasn't waved since November." He said it the second time, the same way he had said it the first. Not for emphasis, because it was the detail that mattered most to him. Garrett connected the drive to his laptop and pulled up 2 weeks of footage at random. We watched in silence at Howard's kitchen table, while morning light came through the window across the street from the very house we were watching on screen. The footage was clear and steady. Simone Alcott entering and exiting on 14 separate occasions across a 6-week sample. Beckett and Simone standing on the front steps at 11:20 p.m. on a Tuesday in January, speaking for 9 minutes before she drove away. A night in early January, the timestamp read 1:47 a.m., when every light in the Crane house came on simultaneously, stayed on for 22 minutes, and then went dark. Howard said quietly, "That was the night I almost called the police. I heard something. A voice. It stopped before I picked up the phone. My phone showed a text from Marcus Webb office device is live. Full coverage. System running clean. Web out." Marcus had approached Beckett's Back Bay Clinic building that morning through a contracted HVAC maintenance company, a legitimate service call arranged by Danny Kowalski, who had a contact in building management. The building's management company had authorized the inspection in writing. Nothing that happened on the 3rd floor that morning required a key that hadn't been provided by the property manager. The inspection had provided a 90-minute access window to the 3rd floor. The supplemental low-frequency resonance device, a compact unit capable of producing sub-audible sound waves that induce mild disorientation and heightened anxiety in enclosed spaces without detectable noise, had been installed behind a ventilation panel in the wall adjacent to Beckett's private office. A secondary microphone unit was now active in the ceiling fixture. Beckett's professional space was now as transparent to us as his home. Garrett closed his laptop. He looked at me across Howard's kitchen table with the expression of someone doing a professional calculation. "This is enough to open a formal investigation," he said. "Not yet," I said. "If we move now, he'll know something has changed. He'll accelerate the timeline. We need him to believe he's still winning." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "How long can Alara hold out, Theodore?" I looked through Howard's front window at the red brick facade of the house across the street. 3rd floor, 2nd window from the left. Alara's room. I did not answer. Garrett called after me as I stood to leave. "Theodore, be careful with this one. He's not just dangerous. He's paranoid. And paranoid men do unpredictable things when they feel cornered." I nodded and stepped out into the cold Boston morning. Beckett was going to accelerate. I could feel it in the structure of his plan, the pending signatures, the increasing medication, the escalating gaslighting sessions caught on footage. He was moving toward a deadline I had not yet identified. I needed to complete one thing before he reached it, something no court order could do for me. The most effective weapon is not always the loudest one. Sometimes it is a single sheet of paper. Sometimes it is the right signature applied at the right moment, to the right document, and your adversary will not know the bullet has been fired until he is holding what he believes is his victory and finds that it has already been made impossible. I had been in courtrooms and interrogation rooms and federal conference rooms for 4 decades. I understood the specific gravity of signed documents the way a notarial seal closes a door that cannot afterward be reopened without considerable effort. Judicial oversight, and the kind of public scrutiny that men like Beckett Crane could not afford. When Constance Hale's assistant showed me into the office on the 14th floor of a State Street building that afternoon, I was not there to discuss options. I was there to close doors. Constance's office communicated precision the way certain people do not, by announcing it, but by the complete absence of anything unnecessary. Bookshelves organized by jurisdiction, spines uniformly aligned, a desk clear of everything except the documents currently under review, a yellow legal pad with margin notes in a small, careful hand, and a coffee mug that had been refilled enough times to leave a permanent ring on the leather desk pad beneath it. Constance herself had been a trust and family law attorney in this city for 18 years, and she carried that experience in the particular unhurried way of someone who has learned that thoroughness is always faster than speed. She had been working on this for 48 hours without a break I could identify. She walked me through the trust instrument first. The document she had prepared was an irrevocable spendthrift trust under Massachusetts general laws. Chapter 2, 103. E, a structure specifically designed to prevent any beneficiary or third party from accessing, redirecting, or attaching claims against the held assets outside of full judicial review. Nora Crane was designated as sole beneficiary. The assets I was contributing a combination of managed investment accounts and a designated portion of my retirement. Holdings would be transferred upon execution and would remain legally locked until Nora reached the age of 25, or until a court of competent jurisdiction ordered otherwise following a full evidentiary hearing. No single individual could dissolve this trust. Not Beckett, not me, not anyone whose name was not on the bench of a Massachusetts probate court. Once you sign, Constance said, this becomes a matter of public record filed with Suffolk County Probate. If Beckett Crane attempts to access anything connected to Nora's financial future, he will find a wall he cannot get around without standing in front of a judge and explaining himself in detail. I picked up the pen and began working through the signature pages. While I signed, Constance briefed me on the guardianship petition. She had filed the emergency application with the Probate and Family Court that morning, attaching Dr. Margaret Olson's written clinical assessment, which documented the anomalous prescription dosages, the medications outside standard postpartum protocol, and the unauthorized alterations to Alara's intake records that Dr. Olson had not sanctioned. Alongside the medical documentation, Constance had submitted a selection of footage excerpts that Marcus Webb had formatted for legal submission, demonstrating a documented pattern of systematic psychological manipulation constituting imminent risk of harm. The court will respond within 72 hours, Constance said. If the temporary order is granted, it immediately suspends Alara's legal capacity to execute binding documents and appoints you as guardian ad litem pending a full hearing. Nothing she signs between now and that hearing will be enforceable. I signed the last page. Constance pressed the notarial seal, slid the document into a manila envelope, closed the clasp, and locked it in the steel cabinet behind her desk. The sound of that cabinet lock engaging was one of the most satisfying sounds I had heard in 3 weeks. Then she set a second folder on the desk. There is something else you need to understand about Beckett Crane, she said, before we talk about next steps. What Constance had uncovered in 48 hours of financial background research was precise and damaging. In late 2022, Beckett had entered a private real estate investment trust alongside 2 other limited partners structured around the acquisition and commercial development of 3 Seaport District properties. By mid-2024, 2 of the 3 had failed to secure the necessary zoning permits, and the third had entered receivership. Beckett's personal capital exposure from this venture was approximately $340,000. In an attempt to offset that loss, he had taken a series of short-term margin loans against his brokerage accounts, loans that had since compounded under interest into a total outstanding debt of approximately $480,000, net of his remaining liquid assets. He doesn't just want the insurance settlement, Constance said. He needs it to survive financially. The distinction changes everything about how he will behave when he feels this plan is threatened. A greedy man plans carefully and waits. A desperate man compresses his timeline and accepts risk he would otherwise avoid. She turned to the final section of the folder. Over the preceding 6 months, a total of $34,000 had been transferred from the joint checking account held by Beckett and Alara Crane into a personal savings account registered in the name of Simone Alcott. The transfers had been structured in amounts designed to remain below the $10,000 automatic federal reporting threshold, $2,800. Here, $4,400 there, $3,100 on a Tuesday in December. But their pattern mapped across a timeline and cross-referenced against the dates in the policy transfer timeline document was unambiguous. Simone Alcott had been receiving compensation from marital funds on a schedule that corresponded directly with her documented access to the Crane residence. She is not a peripheral figure, Constance said. She is a financial co-conspirator. Her name is on documented transfers. That constitutes potential federal wire fraud exposure, and she will understand that the moment anyone explains it to her clearly. Garrett is making contact with her today, I said. Good. Constance removed her reading glasses and set them on the desk. She looked at me with the directness of someone who was about to say something she had been considering how to phrase. Theodore, when this reaches a courtroom, and it will reach a courtroom, I need one commitment from you. Let the system do what it is designed to do. Don't get ahead of it. I met her eyes. I spent 40 years making the system work constants. I know precisely where its edges are. She held my gaze for a moment, then gave a single nod and began organizing the remaining documents into their respective folders. I buttoned my coat, thanked her, and took the elevator down to the lobby. The late afternoon light through the building's glass facade was the thin, colorless light of a Boston February that has exhausted its patience. People moved through the lobby with briefcases and phone screens and the particular forward lean of a city at the end of a working day. My phone vibrated once in my coat pocket. A message from Marcus Webb, 4 words. He's moving faster now. I stopped in the center of the lobby. The foot traffic continued around me without adjustment. I read the message a second time. Not because I had misread it, but because I wanted to be precise about what I was feeling before I decided what to do next. I had anticipated acceleration, the debt figures, the pending signatures, the escalating gaslighting sessions. The medication increases all of it, described a man who was already running behind a schedule he had set for himself. But the trust document had been signed less than 30 minutes ago. The guardianship petition had been filed this morning. Beckett was moving, and he did not yet know that the ground beneath his plan had already been fundamentally altered. He was about to discover that the most dangerous opponent he had ever encountered was not a courtroom attorney or a federal investigator. It was a 60-year-old man with a notebook and 40 years of patience who had been watching him from the very first day. When prey begins to suspect, a predator has 2 choices: withdraw or move faster. Beckett chose speed, but he was too disciplined to let it show. The dinner invitation was not a sign of calm. It was acceleration wearing the face of hospitality. I had spent enough years studying behavioral profiles to know which choice Beckett Crane would make. He did not have the temperament for withdrawal. Withdrawal required the ability to accept a temporary loss in service of a longer strategy. And men who had spent their careers constructing an identity around intellectual dominance did not voluntarily surrender ground. That evening, sitting at Beckett's dining table for the 3rd time, I watched the first small fractures appear in a mask he had spent years perfecting. He had invited me. That was the first thing to understand. The invitation had come through Alara, a message relayed with the particular careful brightness she used when presenting Beckett's decisions as shared ones. Beckett thought it would be nice to have you for dinner this week. He says he feels like we haven't had enough time together as a family. I had accepted without hesitation and arrived at 7 with a bottle of wine and a prescription receipt from a Boston internist I had visited that afternoon. A genuine appointment, a genuine receipt. A genuine reason for being in the city that would hold up to any scrutiny Beckett applied. The table was set for 3. Nora was already asleep upstairs. The house carried its familiar quality of enforced perfection, flowers centered exactly on the sideboard, the kind of ambient jazz that signals a curated atmosphere rather than personal taste. Beckett met me at the door with the warmth of a host who has prepared for this performance and found himself satisfied with the preparation. Alara appeared from the kitchen, carrying a serving dish, and I registered 2 things simultaneously. She was moving more carefully than she had 2 weeks ago, the deliberate, slightly disconnected movement of someone managing a higher medication load. And when she saw me, something behind her eyes shifted. Not alertness exactly, more like the quality of light in a room when a window is opened by an inch. She was still in there. Dinner proceeded along the lines Beckett had scripted for it. He asked about my health, with the solicitous attention of an ideal son-in-law. He asked about the physician's appointment, listened to my explanation of minor blood pressure management, with what appeared to be genuine interest, and filed it away behind his eyes. He spoke about his work, a research paper. He was completing a conference in Chicago in April, a grant renewal that had been approved. He used the word "we" when describing household decisions, and the word "I" when crediting professional accomplishments. The same asymmetry I had documented from the footage, performed now in real time, across a dinner table. I played my part carefully. The slightly distracted grandfather pleased to be included, not entirely following the professional conversation. I asked Beckett to explain his research in simpler terms. I laughed at the right moments. I refilled my own wine glass slowly enough that Beckett could see I was not drinking quickly, which communicated ease and lowered vigilance. After the dishes were cleared, Beckett set a folder on the table. He did it smoothly with the ease of someone who has rehearsed the gesture enough times that it no longer looks like a gesture. He opened it to a single document, the insurance policy transfer authorization, and positioned it on the table between himself and Alara, angled so that I could see it clearly from my seat across the table. "I've been meaning to get this finalized," he said, addressing Alara with the measured warmth of a physician explaining a beneficial procedure. It's really just a formality designating the policy structure to ensure Nora's financial security is protected regardless of circumstance. Our attorney reviewed it last week. He turned to me. I'm sure as Alara's father, you'd agree that securing Nora's financial future is the responsible thing to do. I looked at the document. I let a beat pass the beat of a man reading at the pace of someone who does not read legal documents often. Then I nodded slowly. Of course, I said. A father always wants what's best for his grandchild. Beckett smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just confirmed his own read of the room. Alara picked up the pen. Her hand was not entirely steady. I watched her fingers close around it, and I felt the particular cold clarity that comes when a situation has reached the moment you have been moving toward for weeks, and you understand that the next 5 seconds will determine the shape of everything that follows. I reached across and placed my hand over hers, gently, the way a father does. "Sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice at the easy, unhurried register of a man making a mild observation. "Take your time. There's no rush with something this important." The words were harmless to anyone listening. They were the words of a considerate father who did not want his daughter to feel pressured. Beckett could not object to them, without objecting to the appearance of consideration. But to Alara, who had not heard a voice say, "Take your time in this house and longer than I wanted to calculate," the sentence meant something different. It meant, "I see you. I am here. You are not alone." She set the pen down. "I'd like to read through it again tomorrow," she said. Her voice was quiet, slightly blurred at the edges, but the sentence was complete, and it was hers. Beckett absorbed this. I watched him manage the response, a half-second recalibration behind his eyes, and then the gracious nod of a man who is demonstrating patience. "Of course," he said. At the door I shook his hand. It was the 4th time we had shaken hands. The previous 3 times I had performed the grip of a man who was slightly uncertain of his own physical presence, the mild, loose handshake of an older gentleman. This time I held his hand 1 second longer than necessary, and I looked at him directly, not with the soft, unfocused gaze I had been practicing in my hotel room mirror for 3 weeks, with the other set of eyes, the ones that had spent 4 decades reading people in rooms where everything mattered. 1 second, then I smiled and released his hand. He had seen it. I knew because his jaw set by a fraction that had nothing to do with the cold air coming through the open door. In the car 3 blocks away, I called Garrett. "He'll move within 72 hours, I said. "Have Danny Kowalski ready, and tell Constance I need that guardianship order active before Alara touches another pen." I ended the call. Through the windshield, Boston at night offered nothing back but its own indifferent dark. Whatever Beckett did next was his move, but the board had already been altered in ways he could not yet see. I was not in that room on the afternoon it happened, but Marcus Webb was through the devices I had placed the week before, and he relayed every detail to me in real time, word for word, with the voice of a man who had seen too many terrible things across a long career to be easily disturbed, but who had not yet made his peace with cruelty that was systematic and patient and dressed in the language of care. Marcus called me at 4:11 p.m. I was sitting in my hotel room with my coat still on my notebook, open to a blank page waiting. "He's starting," Marcus said. I did not speak. I listened. The footage Marcus was monitoring showed Beckett and Alara on the cream sofa, the same sofa I had sat across from on 3 separate visits. The insurance transfer document was on the coffee table between them, positioned with the signature line facing Alara. Beckett sat at an angle that placed his body between Alara and the room's exit. Not a dramatic obstruction, not anything that could be described as threatening in isolation, but a positioning that a trained observer would recognize as deliberate. He had placed himself between his wife and the door. His voice coming through the audio feed was gentle. "I know you've been struggling, Alara. I know the last few months have been hard. This is just one less thing to worry about. It's for Nora. You understand that." Alara looked at the document. Her voice, when it came, was softer than I had heard it, the particular softness of someone whose cognitive edges have been dulled. The medication increase that morning had done precisely what Beckett had designed it to do. "Dad seemed unsure about this," she said. A pause. In that pause I could hear Beckett recalibrating. "Your father belongs to a different generation, Alara. He doesn't understand modern financial planning. These structures didn't exist when he was raising you." Another pause, shorter. "And honestly, his judgment hasn't been what it was lately. You've noticed that too, haven't you?" I was sitting in a hotel room in Cambridge, listening to a man dismantle me in front of my own daughter, using months of carefully planted doubt as the mechanism. I had documented this technique in federal behavioral profiles. I had testified about it in 3 separate federal proceedings. I had explained it to juries in language simple enough that 12 ordinary people could understand what it meant and why it destroyed people from the inside out. Hearing it applied to Alara in Beckett's measured and gentle voice was a different experience entirely. She hesitated. 3 seconds, then she nodded slowly. The nod of a woman who had been told in small, careful increments across months of close proximity that the people who loved her most were the least qualified to understand her situation. The nod of someone who had been separated from her own judgment so gradually that she could no longer locate the boundary between her conclusions and the ones that had been constructed for her. She picked up the pen. "That's right," Beckett said. "You're making a responsible decision. I'm proud of you." The scratch of pen on paper lasted approximately 4 seconds. Beckett collected the document with both hands, stood, and walked directly to his study. He did not pause. He did not look back at Alara. The performance of the caring husband had concluded, and he had moved immediately to the next operational step. Without the transitional moment that an actual caring husband would have provided a hand on the shoulder, a word, something, he simply walked away. Alara sat on the sofa with her hands in her lap. Marcus said, "She just signed." I closed my eyes for 1 second. In that second, I allowed myself to feel what I had been holding at arm's length for 3 weeks, the specific grief of a father who has watched his daughter be diminished by someone she trusted, and who made the calculated decision to wait rather than act, because acting too soon would have made everything worse. That grief was real, and it was heavy, and I gave it exactly 1 second. Then I opened my eyes. "Good," I said. "Now we move." 3 blocks from the Crane residence, in the parking lot of a coffee shop on Charles Street, Garrett Okafor was sitting across a small table from Simone Alcott. Garrett had contacted her that morning through a mutual acquaintance presenting himself as a financial investigator conducting a routine review. Simone had agreed to meet, which told Garrett something about her current level of anxiety, because people who have done nothing wrong do not agree to informal financial reviews without asking more questions. He placed the bank transfer documentation on the table between them. $34,000, 14 transfers, her name on every receiving account. Simone looked at the papers for a long moment without speaking. "I want to be clear about what this means for you legally," Garrett said, in the even tone he reserved for conversations where the other person needed to understand their situation before they could make a rational decision. "These transfers in this pattern, from a marital account, correlated with the documented timeline of an insurance fraud scheme that is federal wire fraud exposure, potentially conspiracy charges. You are not the primary subject of this investigation, but you are in the documentation." Simone Alcott was not a foolish woman. She had understood what she was involved in, and she had made a calculation that the reward was worth the risk. What Garrett was showing her was that the risk had changed shape without her knowledge. She agreed to cooperate before the coffee arrived. At 4:43 p.m., I called Constance Hale. "He has the signature," I said. "I know." Constance's voice carried the focused calm of someone in the middle of executing a plan they have prepared for. "The irrevocable trust was filed with Suffolk County Probate this morning, and Theodore the emergency guardianship order was granted 31 minutes ago. It has been entered into the court record. The signature Beckett just obtained was executed by a person under a legally recognized guardianship order without the guardian's consent, while under the documented influence of medication prescribed at non-therapeutic levels. It is void, unenforceable. He has a piece of paper that means nothing." I said, "And Simone." Garrett's call came through on the other line before Constance finished her sentence. She's in," he said. "Full cooperation. She'll provide testimony, financial records, access logs to the residence, everything." I did not need Marcus to tell me what Beckett was doing at that moment. I knew precisely where he was sitting and precisely what he was holding, because I had spent 6 weeks learning to think the way he thought. He had been moving toward this moment for months. The planning, the patience, the medication management, the careful architecture of doubt and dependency, all of it had converged on 4 seconds of pen on paper. He did not know that in the same moment he sat back in his chair and allowed himself for the first time in months to breathe 3 separate telephone calls were concluding in 3 separate locations across the city of Boston, and every one of them concerned him directly. He did not know that tomorrow morning someone would knock on his door. Not a worried grandfather with wine and a prescription receipt. Someone else entirely. Before I show you the moment, Beckett Crane watched everything he built collapse in front of him, comment the number 12 below. So I know you are still here and ready for what comes next. And a quick note, some elements of this story are fictional shaped for narrative and educational purposes. If this kind of content is not for you, this is a good place to stop, no pressure either way. There is a moment in every case I ever worked that I came to call the pivot point, the moment when the person who believed they were in control discovers with complete and irreversible clarity that the control they had been exercising was a story they had been telling themselves. I had witnessed that moment hundreds of times across 4 decades. Standing on Beckett Crane's front steps that morning, between Constance Hale and Garrett Okafor, I was about to create it for the first time. I knocked on the door at 9 o'clock precisely. Beckett answered in 30 seconds, dressed composed already in the posture of a man who had begun his professional day. He saw me first. Then his eyes moved to Constance's briefcase in hand, and to Garrett, whose bearing communicated law enforcement with the quiet authority of someone who has spent 22 years not needing to announce it. Something moved behind Beckett's face in the space of half a second. Not fear, not yet. A recalibration, the rapid, involuntary reassessment of a man who has just encountered a variable his model did not account for. "Good morning, Beckett," I said. "We need to talk." He stepped back from the door. I noted that he stepped back rather than blocking the instinct of a man who understood that obstruction in front of witnesses carrying legal documents was not a viable strategy. We walked into the living room, the cream sofa, the abstract paintings, the engineered perfection of a space designed to communicate authority. I had sat across from all of it 4 times now. It had never intimidated me. Alara appeared at the top of the stairs, Nora against her shoulder. She looked down at the 3 of us, and I watched her face move through several registers in quick succession, surprise, confusion. And beneath those, something that had not been there for months. The faint tentative quality of a person beginning to wonder if they had been right about something they were told to doubt. Constance set the document folder on the coffee table and opened it without preamble. "Mr. Crane," she said in the voice she used when she was not asking questions, "I represent Theodore Whitfield in his capacity as emergency temporary guardian of Alara. Whitfield Crane, pursuant to an order issued yesterday afternoon by the Suffolk County Probate and Family Court under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 190B. She placed the first document in front of him. "This is the court order. You'll see it was entered into the record at 4:12 p.m. yesterday." Beckett picked it up. His hands were steady. I gave him credit for that. "The insurance transfer document signed by Alara yesterday afternoon is void and unenforceable," Constance continued. "It was executed by a person under an active guardianship order, without the guardian's knowledge or consent, while under the influence of prescription medication documented by her attending physician as impairing cognitive judgment at the dosage levels administered. 3 independent grounds for invalidation. Any attempt to submit or act on that document will be met with immediate legal challenge and referral for criminal investigation." She placed the second document on the table. "This is the irrevocable trust instrument filed this morning with Suffolk County Probate. All assets designated therein are held for the sole benefit of Nora Crane until she reaches majority. The trust cannot be dissolved, redirected, or attached by any party without full judicial review." Beckett read. I watched his hands. The paper shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-tension in the fingers that his face did not allow. "This is absurd," he said. His voice was controlled, measured, carrying the mild outrage of a man who has been accused of something he considers beneath him. "Alara signed that document voluntarily. She was perfectly coherent. Dr. Margaret Olson's clinical assessment, submitted to the court as supporting evidence documents otherwise," Constance said. "Her written findings are in the 3rd attachment." Beckett set the papers down on the table with a precision that was itself a form of control. He looked at me directly. For the first time since the dinner party in January, neither of us was performing anything for the other. "You've been planning this," he said. It was not a question. "I have," I said, "for several weeks." "You're going to tell me there's nothing left for me to take." "There's nothing left for you to take," I said. "The trust is irrevocable. The signature is void." Simone Alcott provided a full cooperating statement to federal investigators yesterday evening regarding the financial transfers made in her name. I let that land. "There is nothing in this house or connected to it that belongs to you, Beckett. There never was. The mask came off in sections. I had seen it happen before, the incremental failure of a maintained presentation under pressure that cannot be managed away. The first section was in his eyes. The warmth that he deployed with clinical precision simply vacated the way a light source cuts when a switch is thrown. What replaced it was what had always been underneath: cold, precise, and entirely calculating. The second section was his posture. The open collegial stance of the ideal son-in-law compressed into something narrower and more deliberate. He looked at me with his real face for the first time. "You think this is finished?" he said. His voice had dropped in register, shed the professional warmth entirely. "I think it's just beginning," I said. Garrett, who had not spoken once during the entire exchange, simply stood by the door with his arms at his sides. His presence said everything that needed to be said about what happened to people who made the wrong choice in the next 30 seconds. Beckett made no choice. He stood very still. We walked out. On the front steps, I heard a sound behind me, lighter footsteps on the hard wood different from Beckett's. I turned. Alara had followed us out. She was still holding Nora, her coat pulled over her shoulders imperfectly, as though she had grabbed it without thinking. She reached for my hand with her free hand and held it. "Dad," she said, "what is happening?" I held her hand and looked straight ahead at the cold Boston morning. "You're safe." She nodded and stepped back inside. I had already arranged with Garrett that he would return that evening. This morning was about the documents. Tonight would be about getting her out, I said. That's everything you need to know right now. Behind us, the front door of the house on Beacon Hill closed. Beckett Crane was on the other side of it. A man who had just had everything taken from him, who was paranoid by nature and cornered by circumstance, was now alone in a house full of evidence, with nothing left to lose and a personality structure that did not accommodate defeat. Garrett's warning from Howard Briggs's kitchen came back to me with new weight. Paranoid men do unpredictable things when they feel cornered. In criminal psychology, there is a clinical term for what happens when a person with a severe personality disorder begins losing the ability to maintain their functional facade under sustained pressure. The term is decompensation, the failure of compensatory mechanisms. In plain language, the constructed self that the individual has built, maintained, and deployed across every professional and personal relationship begins to fracture, and the underlying pathology becomes visible in behavior that can no longer be fully controlled or concealed. I had studied decompensation in research settings. I had documented it in federal case files and testified about it in court. I had explained its mechanics to juries in language simple enough that 12 ordinary people could understand why it happened and what it looked like when it did. That evening, sitting in my Cambridge hotel room with Marcus Webb on my encrypted laptop screen, on my instruction, Marcus activated it deliberately the first time in my career I had ever given that order. Marcus had maintained the infrasound unit in Beckett's Back Bay office since we placed it during the HVAC maintenance call earlier that week, a compact device installed behind a ventilation panel on the third floor, emitting sound waves between 15 and 18 hertz. Infrasound operates below the threshold of conscious human hearing. The mind cannot identify it as a sound source. What it produces instead is a cluster of physiological responses: persistent low-grade unease, mild spatial disorientation, a heightened and sourceless startle response, and at sustained exposure. Minor visual processing delays that the brain interprets as perceptual anomalies. For a person already under significant psychological pressure, those anomalies are not easily dismissed. For a forensic psychologist who could identify every symptom he was experiencing and still could not stop experiencing them, it would be something else entirely. "He's been at his desk for 90 minutes, Marcus said, watching the office feed from his own location. "Reviewing legal documents, looking for leverage against the trust instrument. Start at 15 hertz, I said. Low threshold, 20 minutes before any increase." Beckett sat alone under the white overhead light, his professional composure fully intact, working through the documents with the focused precision of a man who had decided that the problem in front of him was solvable if sufficient intelligence was applied with sufficient patience. I recognized the posture. I had spent my career in rooms with people who believed that. The first sign came at the 11-minute mark. He paused, mid-page, looked up at the ceiling for 2 seconds, then returned to the document. The subconscious registration of something without identifiable source, the mind's first unanswered question. 7 minutes later, he stood and checked the thermostat on the wall. The temperature had not changed. He stood at the thermostat for a moment longer than the action required, then sat back down. At the 23-minute mark, Marcus increased the frequency by 2 hertz. Beckett set his pen down, placed both palms flat on the desk surface, and sat very still. I could see him doing what he was trained to do, pivoting from subject to analyst, applying his professional framework to his own symptom profile. Acute stress response, anxiety presentation, physiological sequelae of sustained psychological pressure, nothing more. He stood and walked to the window. Back Bay at night offered its particular organized geometry streetlights and rose the occasional moving vehicle, the horizontal logic of a planned urban neighborhood. He stood at the glass for 1 minute and 40 seconds before returning to the desk. When he looked up at the frame mirror mounted on the north wall, he stopped moving. The reflection was his own, but infrasound at sustained exposure produces a measurable delay in visual processing, a half-frame asynchrony between physical movement and perceived reflection. For one extended moment, the man in the mirror moved 1 beat behind the man standing in the room. Beckett turned away from the mirror without looking at it again. 3 blocks from the Crane residence, Garrett Okafor and Danny Kowalski received the confirmation text from Marcus at 8:43 subject stationary. Proceed. They walked to the front door of the Beacon Hill house and knocked twice. Alara opened the door. Theodore had spoken with her that afternoon, briefly carefully giving her only what she needed and nothing more. She looked at Garrett, then at the car at the curb. And she did something I had been waiting through 6 weeks of surveillance and legal preparation to witness. She made a decision without checking behind her to see if someone was watching. She went upstairs, came back with Nora in her arms, and a bag she had packed herself at. Some point during the day, she had known this moment was coming and had prepared for it quietly, in her own time, without being told exactly how. And she walked out of that house without hesitating at the threshold. Simone, seated in a separate vehicle 2 blocks from Beckett's office building, sent the text from a number Beckett recognized as Alara's secondary contact. Going to bed early. Nora was up all night. Don't worry about calling. At 9:14, Beckett's office line appeared on Simone's phone. Garrett, who had returned after confirming Alara, and Nora were safely in transit, nodded once. Simone answered. Beckett. Her voice was exactly what it needed to be, level warm, unremarkable. The voice of a woman with nothing particular on her mind. I'm exhausted. What is it? A pause. When Beckett spoke, his voice carried something Simone had not heard in it before. Not the controlled frustration of a man managing his presentation. Not the confident authority of a man executing a plan. Something rawer and less organized. It's something is wrong, he said. I cannot identify what it is, but something is very wrong. You're stressed, Simone said. Go home. You need to sleep. A longer pause. Then, with the flat certainty of a man who has decided on a course of action, come to the warehouse. Tonight. There's something that needs to be handled. Simone looked at Garrett. He gave a single deliberate nod. 20 minutes, she said, and ended the call. In his office, Beckett stood, gathered his coat, and turned off the overhead light. At the doorway, he stopped. He looked back into the dark room, the particular stillness of a man who was not entirely confident that the space behind him contained only what it had always contained. Then he left. The bait had been taken without a hand to guide it. In my experience, a trap that the subject walks into on their own initiative is always the most consequential kind and always the most dangerous. People ask me, sometimes colleagues, students in the seminars, I used to give younger agents who wanted to understand how the work was really done, how you catch a smart person. The answer has always been the same. You don't catch them. You let them catch themselves. You design the environment with sufficient precision that they walk into it voluntarily, at a time of their own choosing, believing the entire time that the idea was theirs. I was not in that warehouse on Dry Dock Avenue. Garrett had secured the necessary court authorization for the warehouse surveillance 48 hours earlier. Everything transmitting to that screen was being recorded with full legal standing. The temperature outside my window was 19 degrees. The temperature inside the warehouse, according to the environmental sensor Marcus had placed with the cameras, was not much higher. I watched and I did not speak. Simone made the call at 11:03 p.m., exactly as Garrett had scripted it. Her voice when Beckett answered carried the precise calibration of controlled panic, not theatrical. Not overdone the specific vocal quality of a person who is frightened, but trying to manage the fear rather than surrender to it. Garrett had briefed her carefully on this. Beckett was trained to identify false emotional presentation. The performance had to be real enough to pass his evaluation in under 3 seconds. It passed. "It's done," Simone said. "But there's a problem. You need to come to the warehouse on Dry Dock. Now." She ended the call before he could ask questions. That had been Garrett's instruction. Give him enough to pull him forward. Don't give him enough to think. Beckett arrived at 11:31. On the feed from camera 3 positioned at the warehouse entrance, angled down from a ceiling beam, I watched him push through the side door and stop just inside the threshold. He stood still for 4 full seconds, reading the space the way a person does when they enter an unfamiliar environment, and their survival instincts require a baseline assessment before they allow themselves to proceed. Then he moved forward. Camera 5, covering the central floor, showed what he saw when he rounded the first row of empty shelving units. The figure on the floor had been prepared by a forensic staging specialist from the FBI Boston field office, a task Garrett had arranged through channels that did not require public documentation. It was not a body. It was a construction of sufficient visual and physical accuracy under the conditions of a dark warehouse lit only by Simone's flashlight to register to an arriving person as what it was intended to represent. Beckett crossed to it in 8 steps. He did not make the sounds an innocent person makes. He did not call out Alara's name. He did not reach for his phone. He stood over the figure for approximately 5 seconds, and then he began to calculate. I could see it in the feed, the slight stillness that precedes organized thought in people whose first response to a crisis is not emotion, but strategy. He said to Simone, "Where did it happen?" Not what happened, not is she breathing, not call an ambulance. Where did it happen? Garrett, monitoring from a secondary location with Danny Kowalski and 4 officers from the Massachusetts State Police, heard the same feed I was watching. I saw his message appear in the text chain. Recording, all 6 feeds active, continuing. Beckett crouched beside the figure. He spoke for the next 4 minutes in a voice that was low organized, and entirely without the quality of a man who had just encountered something that horrified him. He directed Simone on what to touch and what not to touch. He discussed weight and distance in the harbor. He used the word problem 4 times and the word clean 3 times. He touched the figure's left shoulder to reposition it and left a full handprint on the fabric. He said at one point with the flat precision of a man thinking aloud, "The medication levels will show in the autopsy. We need the body in the water before morning." Forensic toxicology had been a required module in his doctoral program. He knew exactly how long certain compounds remained detectable in tissue. I sat very still in my hotel room. I had spent 40 years building cases. I had listened to confessions and admissions and incriminating statements in every form that human language produces them. What Beckett Crane said in that warehouse in 4 minutes to 6, hidden cameras transmitting in real time to a recording server, was one of the cleanest self-constructed evidentiary records I had ever witnessed. He was not coerced. He was not confused. He was not speaking under duress. He was a man executing a plan he believed was his own, in a space he believed was private, in front of an audience he did not know existed. When he reached down to lift the figure by the shoulders, the lights came on, all of them, simultaneously. The warehouse's overhead industrial fixtures flooded the space with the particular harsh white light that leaves nowhere to stand that isn't fully visible. From 3 separate entry points, the side door, the loading bay, and the interior fire exit officers entered. Danny Kowalski came through the loading bay door, first badge visible, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who has been waiting and is no longer waiting. Simone stepped sideways to the wall, her hands already visible. Simone had been positioned behind the far shelving unit before Beckett entered out of his sightline until the lights came on. The handcuffs Garrett had agreed to as part of the cooperating witness protocol were now back in place, visible for the first time. She looked at Beckett with an expression I could read even on the grainy warehouse feed. Not triumph, not satisfaction. The complicated relief of a person stepping out of something they had been inside for long enough that they had begun to forget what outside felt like. Garrett came through the side door last. He walked to the center of the warehouse floor and stood in front of Beckett Crane without any of the procedural formality that the moment technically required. "Beckett Crane," he said, "you are under arrest." Beckett looked at the cameras. He counted them. I watched his eyes move from one to the next in the systematic way of a man whose training had not abandoned him even now. He looked at Simone. He looked at the figure on the floor, which was not what he had believed it to be. He looked at the door through which he had entered, which was now occupied by 2 officers. He understood the full architecture of what had happened to him. I could see the moment of comprehension in his posture, the small, Involuntary stillness of a person receiving information that reorganizes everything they thought they knew about the preceding weeks. Then he smiled. It was not a large smile. It was precise and contained and directed at the camera nearest to him, as though he already knew I was on the other end of it, as though he was sending a message across the feed directly to the room where I was sitting. Garrett paused for 1 second, then he nodded to Danny, and the handcuffs went on. In Cambridge, I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a while. Then I called Garrett. He smiled. I said, "I know," Garrett said. "He's not finished," I said. "He has one more move, and he's going to make it in the interrogation room. I have sat in hundreds of interrogation rooms across 4 decades on both sides of the table. I know precisely what those rooms are and what they are not. They are not where criminals are caught. Catching happens before anyone enters the room. What an interrogation room is designed to produce is disclosure, the specific pressure of a sealed space, and a single focused relationship, calibrated to create the moment when a person reveals through what they say, or what they choose not to say, exactly who they are. If you know how to construct the right silence in the right place, the person across the table does the rest themselves. Beckett Crane voluntarily requested to speak with me before his attorney arrived, his right to do so clearly documented by the booking officer on duty. Garrett relayed the request in the corridor outside the holding area, with the expression of a man who had expected it. I had expected it too. It was the move I had told Garrett about from my hotel room 40 minutes earlier when we discussed the smile. I agreed to go in on one condition: full camera recording, Garrett monitoring from the adjacent room through the one-way glass. He agreed without hesitation. I sat down across from Beckett at 11:58 p.m. He was still in his overcoat. His hands rested on the metal table, uncuffed a detail he had specifically requested, and one that told me he wanted the physical language of an equal rather than a detainee. I noted it and said nothing about it. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "So," he said, "the old man finally shows his real face." "I have been showing you my real face for several weeks," I said. "You were simply looking at the wrong things." He settled back in his chair, a measured recalibration, the micro-shift of a man deciding to treat what followed as a professional exchange rather than an arrest. I recognized the posture. It was the stance he used with patients he intended to guide somewhere without their awareness. He began with reframing the first technique in the sequence I had anticipated. He suggested that what I had done constituted entrapment, that the devices placed in his home and office without a warrant represented Fourth Amendment violations that would collapse the evidentiary case before trial. He delivered this not as an accusation, but as a clinical observation in the measured tone of a man presenting a differential diagnosis. He was not arguing, he was positioning. I let him finish. Then I said, "The devices in your home were installed during lawful visits to which you invited me. The devices in your office were installed during a scheduled maintenance call in a commercial building. Garrett Okafor can speak to the warrant status of the warehouse recordings if you'd like that conversation, but I don't think that's why you asked to see me." A pause. His eyes moved across my face in the way I had watched him move his eyes across Alara, assessing, cataloging, looking for the soft place. "You want to understand how it happened?" he said. "You want me to confirm that you outmaneuvered me. That's why you came in here." "I came in here because you asked," I said, "and because I have something to show you." I placed the folder on the table between us. It was not thick 31 pages tabbed and organized, the product of 5 years of intermittent research. I had not assembled it for this moment. I had assembled it long before this moment existed. Beckett looked at the folder without touching it. Something shifted behind his eyes, not fear, not yet, but the particular alertness of a person who has encountered an unexpected variable. "Do you know when I first heard your name?" I said. He said nothing, which was itself an answer. Beckett Crane did not decline to answer questions unless the question had caught him off balance. "What, 5 years ago?" I said. A former colleague at the Bureau flagged a pattern: 3 patient complaint filings against a young clinical psychologist in Boston, submitted to the state licensing board within an 18-month period. All 3 complaints alleged boundary violations and psychological manipulation. All 3 were dismissed. All 3 complainants were subsequently discredited, their own mental health histories used against them in the review process. I opened the folder to the first tabbed section. The colleague who flagged it brought it to me informally, not as a criminal matter, as a behavioral pattern worth watching. Beckett looked at the open page. His jaw moved slightly, not speech, just the involuntary tension of a man absorbing something he had not anticipated. You have been in my research file since then, I said. Not as a suspect, as a subject. I have watched you build your career, your reputation, and your marriage. I watched the pattern from those 3 complaints replicate itself across every significant relationship in your professional life. And when my daughter came home from a dinner party 2 years ago and told me she had met someone remarkable, I recognized your name before she finished the sentence. The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation. Beckett looked at the folder, then at me, then at the folder again. I watched him do the calculation, the rapid involuntary reassessment of every interaction across the preceding months, reframed now through the knowledge that the man he had been performing for had been observing him not for weeks, but for years. He found his footing after a moment. He was too trained to stay unbalanced for long. "Your wife?" he said, with the precise delivery of a man placing a scalpel. "You used her death as cover, as a prop, to get access to my house." I looked at him without blinking. "My wife's death is the hardest thing I have ever carried," I said. "You are correct that I used it. I used the grief that is real and the cover that it provided. Because you did not deserve to see my actual face until this moment, and now you have seen it." Beckett was quiet for a long time. He looked at the folder on the table between us, 31 pages that represented 5 years of a story he had believed he was the author of, and had in fact been a subject of from the beginning. Then he smiled. Not the smile from the warehouse, something smaller and more considered. "Now see you in court, old man," he said. I picked up the folder, stood and buttoned my coat. "Count on it," I said. Garrett was waiting in the corridor. "How did it go?" he said. "He will enter an insanity defense," I said. "It is the only move he has left." Garrett looked at me. "You're certain?" "It is the only play that fits his psychology and his situation simultaneously," I said. "And it is the one I have been prepared for since I opened that folder 5 years ago." 3 months would pass before I saw Beckett Crane again. The next time would be across a different kind of room, one with a judge, a jury, and no place left to hide. 3 months passed between the night of the arrest and the morning the trial opened. 3 months in which Alara recovered one day at a time, slowly at first. Then with the gathering momentum of a person rediscovering what they are capable of when no one is managing their perception of themselves. 3 months in which Nora learned to smile at faces she recognized. 3 months in which Beckett Crane built his final move with the same systematic patience he had applied to everything else. A move I had predicted from the night he looked at me across a warehouse floor and smiled before the handcuffs went on. The John Joseph Moakley Courthouse sits on the South Boston waterfront, its curved glass facade reflecting the harbor. I had testified in federal proceedings in this building twice before. I knew the specific quality of its courtrooms, the high ceilings, the pale wood paneling, the particular formal silence that descends when a bailiff announces the judge. I arrived 40 minutes before the session opened and sat in the gallery where I could see the full room. Beckett entered with his defense team at 8:52. The performance began at the door. He walked slowly, not the measured, deliberate pace of the man I had watched on surveillance footage for 6 weeks, but something softer and less organized. His eyes carried a slightly unfocused quality, directed generally forward rather than at anything specific. His suit, which every previous observation suggested would be immaculate, had a visible crease on the left lapel and a collar that sat marginally off-center, details small enough to be unconscious in a genuinely distressed person, details precise enough in a man of Beckett Crane's habitual self-presentation to be deliberate. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Controlled approximation of dissociative presentation. Entry performance calibrated for jury intake." The prosecution's first witness was Dr. Margaret Olson. She took the stand with the composed directness of a physician who has spent 20 years being precise in high-stakes situations and has learned that clarity is a form of advocacy. She presented Alara's medical record in chronological order, the initial postpartum evaluation, the standard protocol prescription that she had authorized, and the subsequent alterations that appeared in the record bearing her digital signature but not her clinical judgment. She explained in language accessible to every member of the jury what the documented dosage levels would produce in a patient of Alara's, presentation, cognitive blunting, short-term memory, disruption, heightened suggestibility, and the progressive inability to distinguish between her own conclusions and those that had been introduced to her from outside. She said, "In my 20 years of practice, I have not seen a postpartum medication profile altered in this way by accident. The changes required pharmaceutical knowledge system access and a sustained intention that extended across multiple months. Constance Hale then moved to the footage. The clips had been edited and formatted for courtroom presentation, each one time-stamped, each one preceded by a brief contextual note identifying the location and the recording device. The jury watched Beckett enter his own home, and within seconds shed every quality that he was currently performing for this room. The clinical detachment, the systematic undermining of Alara's self-perception, the dinner table conversation in which he constructed a memory she had never made and delivered it to her with the authority of a man she had been conditioned across years to defer to. The courtroom was very quiet during the footage. Beckett sat at the defense table in his carefully calibrated posture. I watched him. Not the footage I had seen the footage. I watched him. Here is what I saw: a man performing a clinical presentation that was technically accurate and structurally wrong. Genuine dissociative disorder, the condition his defense team was asserting, produces a specific set of observable behaviors. Fragmented attention that cannot be sustained even when the subject wishes to sustain it. Involuntary responses to environmental stimuli. A characteristic disconnect between emotional affect and cognitive function that is not under voluntary control, precisely because its defining feature is the failure of voluntary control. What Beckett was producing was a perfect approximation of those behaviors, sustained with complete consistency, modulated appropriately in response to what was happening in the room. When testimony was benign, his presentation softened. When testimony was damaging, it remained steady. The calibration was flawless. And that was exactly what was wrong with it. A person who is genuinely unable to maintain voluntary control of their presentation cannot maintain voluntary control of how they perform that inability. Beckett was too consistent. He was hitting every mark. I wrote in my notebook, metacognitive control fully intact. Presentation is constructed, not experienced. Constance called Simone Alcott. Simone walked to the stand without looking at the defense table. She had been prepared over 3 months of cooperating witness sessions, and she delivered her testimony with the flat, careful accuracy of someone reading from a document. They have memorized the financial transfers, the warehouse meetings, the access to the Crane residence, the timeline that Beckett had constructed and that she had participated in until the morning Garrett Okafor placed the bank records in front of her. Beckett watched her. For 4 seconds, as Simone described the policy transfer timeline document and the role she had been assigned within it, Beckett's eyes sharpened. The unfocused quality he had maintained since the moment he walked through the courtroom door simply vacated, replaced for 4 seconds by the precise, assessing gaze of the man I had watched on surveillance footage, the man I had sat across from in an interrogation room. The man who had built a 3-phase plan to extract $8.75 million from a woman he had systematically dismantled. 4 seconds. Then the performance resumed. Constance turned to face the bench. Your Honor, I would ask the court to note the defendant's response to the preceding testimony for the record. The judge made the notation. In the seat beside me, Alara had been still throughout the afternoon session. When the court recessed, she turned to me. Is he actually sick? She asked. Her voice was quiet but steady. The voice of a woman asking a factual question, not a frightened one. I looked straight ahead at the now empty defense table. No, I said, he is not, and tomorrow I will prove it. In the corridor during recess, Garrett fell into step beside me. Tomorrow's yours, he said. I looked through the courtroom's narrow corridor window at Beckett, conferring with his attorneys. He knew I was scheduled for the stand in the morning. He had been preparing for it. The same way he prepared for everything systematically in advance, with a clear model of what he expected. What he did not know was that my preparation had begun 5 years before his. I have taken the witness stand many times across my career. Every time, I carry the words of the first instructor who taught me forensic examination, a man named Hargrove, who wore the same gray cardigan every day of the 3-week course, and spoke with the unhurried certainty of someone who had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything. He told us, Theodore, the truth does not need to be defended. It only needs to be presented correctly. That morning, I carried 40 years of truth to the witness stand, and I knew as I sat down that it was the last time I would ever do it. Constance established my credentials in 8 minutes, 4 decades, with the FBI Senior Forensic Examiner Expert Witness in 41 federal proceedings. Author of 2 published frameworks for behavioral analysis of personality disorder, presentation in legal contexts. She moved efficiently without flourish. The jury did not need to be impressed by my biography. They needed to understand why what I was about to say carried weight. Then she asked me to explain what I had observed the previous day. I looked at the jury, 12 people who had spent the previous afternoon watching footage and listening to testimony and trying to hold the full shape of something that was difficult to hold. I did not speak to them as an expert speaks to a lay audience. I spoke to them as a person speaks to other people who deserve a straight account. What I observed yesterday, I said, was a technically accurate approximation of dissociative disorder that was structurally inconsistent with genuine dissociative disorder in every way that matters clinically. I explained what genuine dissociative presentation looks like: the involuntary fragmentation of attention, the inability to modulate affect in response to environmental stimuli, the characteristic disconnect between emotional response and cognitive function that is defined precisely by its resistance to voluntary control. I explained what I had watched Beckett Crane produce, instead a performance that hit every observable marker of the condition with a consistency and precision that the condition itself does not permit. A person who genuinely cannot maintain voluntary control of their presentation cannot also maintain voluntary control of how they perform that inability. What I witnessed, I said, was not a man unable to control himself. It was a man exercising complete metacognitive control over the appearance of a man unable to control himself. The distinction is the difference between illness and performance. I then presented the research file. I walked the jury through 5 years of documented behavioral observation, the 3 patient complaints, the systematic discrediting of each complainant, the pattern that had remained consistent across every professional and personal context I had been able to observe. I explained how the same 3-phase structure, isolation, destabilization, legal execution appeared in each documented instance at different scales, with different subjects over a period of years that predated his relationship with my daughter by more than 2. Beckett's lead attorney rose for cross-examination. He was skilled. He had clearly prepared for this testimony and had identified the legal vulnerabilities in my methodology, the informal origins of the research file, the absence of a formal FBI case designation, the fact that I was also the father of the victim and therefore not a disinterested party. He pressed each point with professional precision. I answered each one the same way directly without defensiveness, with the specificity that comes from having spent 5 years with the material. He did not land a point I had not already considered and prepared for. After 17 minutes, he sat down. I remained on the stand and looked at the jury. Beckett Crane is not a sick man, I said. He is a precise man, a calculating man. He understands human psychology at a clinical level, and he has used that understanding across multiple years and multiple relationships to extract what he wanted from people who trusted him. Precision and calculation are the opposite of madness. They are its antithesis. I watched Beckett from the stand as I spoke. He was still performing the soft, unfocused eyes, the carefully calibrated posture of a man not fully present. And then I said his name directly, and I described in clinical terms exactly what his behavioral pattern indicated about his internal experience using the professional vocabulary he had spent his career employing on others. I watched the performance begin to cost him something. It started in his hands, a tightening around the knuckles that had nothing to do with the presentation he was sustaining. Then the jaw, the same microtension I had observed at his own dining table. The involuntary muscular response of a man managing real anger under a constructed surface. The eyes sharpened by degrees. The unfocused quality drawing inward as the actual man behind it became increasingly present. 40 years of studying people in pressure situations had taught me one reliable truth: genuine emotion sustained long enough always finds a way out. He stood up. It was not a large movement. He simply rose from his chair at the defense table, one hand braced on the table's surface, and pointed at me. "You set me up." His voice was not the managed, softened register of the past 2 days. It was precise and cold and entirely controlled the real voice, the one I had heard in the interrogation room. From the beginning, this entire proceeding is the result of entrapment conducted by a private individual with a personal agenda and no legal standing. The gavel came down hard. His attorney had him by the arm before the judge finished speaking. Beckett sat, but the jury had already seen it, the transition from the man who could not control himself to the man who spoke in complete, precisely constructed sentences the moment his actual interests were threatened. I remained on the stand without moving until the judge restored order. The jury retired at 2:14 p.m. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Ilara found me. She stood in front of me without speaking for a long moment, and I let her have that time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "How long did you know?" she asked. "All of it." I looked at my daughter, the woman who had spent 6 months being told that her own perceptions could not be trusted, who had sat in a courtroom for 2 days and watched the full shape of what had been done to her, assembled in public piece by piece, with a precision that matched the precision with which it had been constructed. Long enough, I said, to make sure you would be all right when I told you." She nodded once, then she put her arms around me and I held my daughter in a courthouse corridor in Boston, while the city continued outside the windows. The jury returned at 6:18 p.m. Guilty on all counts. Insanity defense rejected. 15 years, no possibility of parole. Medical license revoked permanently. Simone Alcott, 3 years. Reduced to 18 months in recognition of substantial cooperation with federal investigators. When the officers led Beckett from the courtroom, he turned at the door and looked at me. I looked back. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction of the kind people expect, only the particular stillness of a man who has finished something that needed to be finished. There was one thing left to do, not in a courtroom, not in front of anyone. A letter. Some endings are loud, the crack of a gavel, the sound of handcuffs, the compressed noise of a crowd reacting to a verdict. And some endings are quieter and more honest than that. An autumn afternoon, a cup of tea gone slightly cold, and the sound of your granddaughter discovering in the next room that her own voice can make things happen. 3 months had passed since the verdict, 6 since the arrest. Ilara had signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in Cambridge in July. 2 blocks from a coffee shop she had loved as a graduate student, and 7 miles from the house on Beacon Hill, which was currently the subject of a civil asset proceeding that Constance was managing with her characteristic thoroughness. The apartment was not large. It had scuffed baseboards and a kitchen window that let in more cold than it should, and a radiator that knocked twice every morning at 6:15. It was the warmest place I had been in, longer than I could calculate. I was sitting in the armchair by the window when Ilara came in from the kitchen carrying Nora, 8 months old, round-faced, with Eleanor's eyes dark and serious, and presently occupied with the significant problem of a rubber giraffe that she was attempting to negotiate into her mouth at an angle that physics did not support. Ilara set her in my arms with the ease of a woman who had been doing this long enough that it no longer required thought and went back for the tea. I held my granddaughter and felt something in my chest that I had been carrying since February's shift and go quiet. We sat for a while without talking, which is one of the things I have come to appreciate most about the relationship Ilara and I have rebuilt across the past 6 months. She had learned, in the years of her marriage, to fill silence with carefully managed speech, because silence in that house had been a resource that Beckett controlled. She was unlearning it. Some afternoons, she talked at length about her work, which she had returned to in August, taking on a single small residential project that a former colleague had held for her, about her therapy, which she described with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone who has decided that there is nothing useful in pretending the process is not difficult. Other afternoons, we simply sat, and the silence was the kind that belongs to people who have been through something together and no longer need to narrate it. That afternoon, she asked about the letter. "Did he write back?" she said. "No," I said, "he won't." "How do you know?" Because responding would require acknowledging that the letter mattered to him, and acknowledging that it mattered would mean acknowledging that I understood him. And that is the one thing Beckett Crane will spend the next 15 years refusing to admit. Ilara turned her mug in both hands, a habit she had carried since childhood. "What did you say to him in the letter?" I told her. The letter had not been long. 4 paragraphs written in the same plain institutional language I had used in federal reports across 40 years, not because the situation called for formality, but because that register was the one most precisely calibrated to reach a man whose entire professional identity resided in his command of clinical language. I had written it not as a father and not as a former adversary. I had written it as the researcher addressing the research subject, which was the most accurate description of our relationship and the one that would cost him the most to receive. I had told him that the 3 patient complaints from 5 years ago were now part of a sealed supplemental federal record attached to his case file and would remain there permanently. I had told him that the licensing board's formal findings had been published in the Massachusetts Medical Registry and were accessible to any institution that searched his name. I had told him that the clinical frameworks he had published 2 papers. One book chapter had been formally reviewed by their respective journals and were under reconsideration for retraction pending the outcome of an academic integrity review. And then I had written the last paragraph. You spent your career studying the mechanisms by which a person's sense of self can be systematically removed. You understood the process at a technical level that few practitioners ever achieve. You applied it with a precision that I will, in the interest of accuracy, describe as exceptional. What you did not account for, what your model had no category for, was the possibility of a subject who had been watching you longer than you had been watching them. You are no longer a psychologist, a researcher, or a name in any professional context. You are a number in a federal system. I expect this letter finds you in the process of constructing a new self-narrative that accommodates that fact. I also expect that process will occupy most of the next 15 years. From a research perspective, I find that outcome appropriate. Ilara was quiet for a moment after I finished. "That's the cruelest thing I've ever heard," she said. "Then good." Nora had abandoned the giraffe and was studying my face with the focused attention of a person encountering something they have not yet categorized. I looked back at her and felt, as I had felt every time I held her, the specific and uncomplicated weight of something worth protecting. Ilara stood and moved to the window. Cambridge in September carried its particular quality of light, the angle sharpening toward autumn. The maples along the street beginning their slow turn through amber and red. She stood with one hand on the window frame and looked out at it. "I spent 3 years trying to become what he needed," she said. "I forgot who I was. I actually forgot. It wasn't dramatic. I just stopped being able to find myself." "I know," I said. "Then how did you know I was still in there when I couldn't see it myself?" I looked at my daughter at the line of her shoulders, which no longer carried the collapsed defensive set I had watched on surveillance footage in February, at the way she stood at the window, with her weight evenly distributed taking up the space she was entitled to. "Because I am your father," I said. "And fathers do not stop seeing their children even when their children have stopped seeing themselves." She did not answer. She placed her hand over mine where it rested on the chair arm, and we stayed that way, while the autumn light moved across the floor of her apartment, and Nora made a sound in my arms that was almost very nearly the shape of a word. I drove back to Concord in the early evening when the sky over Route 2 had gone the particular deep blue of a New England autumn at 6 o'clock. I thought about Beckett Crane in a federal corrections facility somewhere in the Massachusetts system, sitting with his exceptional intelligence and his clinical precision and the complete absence of anyone left to use them on. I thought about what 40 years had taught me about people like him, and about the one thing those 40 years had also taught me, that no behavioral framework had ever adequately described. There are things that fall outside the models, outside the clinical vocabulary and the case file notation and the expert testimony, things that operate according to a logic that predates all of it by a long margin. I had spent 4 decades in rooms with the worst iterations of human behavior, and I had remained functional throughout by maintaining a careful distance between my professional judgment and my emotional life. I had been good at it. Eleanor used to say I was too good at it, but she also knew as I drove home that evening in the autumn dark that there were limits to what professional distance could explain. Love, in the form that had kept me watching and waiting and performing and planning for 6 months, without breaking the surface that was not in any framework I had ever written or read. It had no clinical category. It required no methodology. It just was, and it had been enough. There is something I never wrote into any federal report across 40 years, but tonight I want to say it, plainly. I believe God guided me to the right place at the right time. Not coincidence, not strategy, grace, but here is what I need you to hear. I was right about Beckett, and I was wrong about how I handled it. I waited too long. I calculated when I should have acted. I let the fear of imperfection cost my daughter months she will never get back. Don't be like me. If you see someone you love being quietly diminished, don't wait for perfect evidence. The instinct of a heart that still loves is evidence enough. This is my honest opinion after living through it. Family betrayal is never dramatic at first. It is quiet. It is patient. It is built from small moments of control disguised as care, and by the time you name it, the damage is already deep. Every family story contains the possibility of this kind of family betrayal. And every family story also contains the possibility of someone who refuses to look away. Because the cruelest truth about family betrayal is this: it is always committed by someone the victim trusted completely. Every family story deserves to be told, and no family betrayal should ever be allowed to write the ending. I chose not to look away. I hope you would too. If this story moved something in, you leave a comment and tell me what you felt. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and if you believe stories like this, one matter. Subscribe because there is more to come, and none of it will waste your time. Thank you for staying until the very last word. That loyalty means everything. A note for new viewers. Upcoming stories in this series contain fictional elements built for educational and reflective purposes. If that is not what you are looking for, please feel free to step away and find content that serves you better. No hard feelings and no obligation to stay.